Well, world reaction has been mixed to the arrest warrant that was issued for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday for war crimes in Gaza. Israel and the U.S. have rejected the charges brought by the International Criminal Court, but some governments say the Israeli leader would be arrested if he entered their countries. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban has invited Netanyahu to visit Hungary, saying that the court's decision would have no effect. Here in Germany, the government has pointed to its historical relationship with Israel and says that it will take no further action unless Netanyahu plans to visit.
On the one hand, we very much support the importance of the International Criminal Court. And on the other hand, we have our historical responsibility. Our statement should be regarded in light of these two aspects. On that basis, I find it hard to imagine that we would carry out arrests in Germany.
Dass wir auf dieser Grundlage Verhaftungen in Deutschland durchführen.
Let's get more from political correspondent Jenni Graham. Welcome, Jenni. So Germany supports the ICC, but wouldn't enforce these warrants. What's going on?
Well, we heard there from the government spokesperson, Stefan Hebestreit, and he said, obviously, that it would be difficult to imagine a situation where Netanyahu would be arrested here. To put it simply, Germany is going to do everything it can diplomatically to make sure that Netanyahu and his former defence minister don't visit here. If they have to meet, they will do it elsewhere, for example, in the United Nations, in New York, somewhere where they can meet diplomatically. And if Netanyahu were to come here, it would be handled at a judicial level. It would be they would be forced under the ICCC rules to arrest them. It would go above the government here in Germany. Now we heard from Baerbock earlier that this is going to be everything. They're going to establish what they're going to do at a domestic level. It really would only be an issue if Netanyahu or his former defence minister came here. Now, Netanyahu's last visit was in March of 2023, about 6 months before October 7th. And there have in the past been occasions where the German and Israeli cabinets have met for exchanges. The last one of those was in 2018. And they're not a regular thing. They happen very rarely. And nothing like that is on the cards anytime soon. So really, at the moment, it's just a case of wait and see.
OK, thank you, Jenni. Jenni Graham. Well, Yvonne McDermott Rees is a professor in law at Swansea University in the UK. She specialises in international criminal law. Welcome to DW, Professor. We've just heard the leaders of members of the International Criminal Court expressing reluctance to act on these warrants. So how enforceable are they?
Well, the states who have signed up to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court have an obligation to comply with the court, to not interfere with the exercise of its activities. And so I think in practical terms, this means that those states who are signed up, and as you mentioned, there are over 120 states around the world, would be obliged to transfer any of these defendants. So I think it's important to bear in mind that it's not just the two Israeli defendants who, for whom arrest warrants were issued yesterday. There was also a suspect from Hamas. But yeah, the state parties have an obligation to transfer those individuals to the court to stand trial. That being said, you know, we have had examples with, for example, the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, for whom an arrest warrant is still outstanding, who has been able to travel to certain countries like South Africa. Vladimir Putin, for whom there's another arrest warrant out, recently travelled to Mongolia, which is a state party. And the court doesn't have enforcement powers. It doesn't have its own police, for example. So the court really does rely on states, the goodwill of states, to comply with their obligations and to transfer dependents over to stand trial.
So do you think it likely that Benjamin Netanyahu will ever stand trial before the International Criminal Court?
It's impossible to tell, really. I think one thing that's for sure, and we can see this even in the piece we've just heard, is that the issuance of these arrest warrants make life a little bit difficult for those for whom they're issued. It means that he'll have to think twice about where to travel to and what the implications of that travel might be. Whether he'll ever be transferred, we simply don't know. I hope so. I think if for any of these defendants, if they dispute the allegations, the best thing to do would be to come to the court and contest them in court, because otherwise, there's no time limit on these warrants of arrest. They're around forever. So if you think they're without foundation, the best thing is to come with your defence counsel and contest the charges in court.
That, or be a friend of the United States, because we have had criticisms from Africa and the Global South for years that the ICC only goes after African leaders and those leaders who aren't aligned with the West. And what we've heard seems to give substance to those claims.
Yeah, I was really struck by the comments of the German spokesperson there. Germany was in the room when the statute of the International Criminal Court was drawn up. The obligations that exist for state parties exist equally. The whole principle of the court is that it's supposed to be that no one is above the law, and that states will transfer individuals for whom there's a reasonable grounds to believe that they've committed war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide. So, I think we're starting to see those double standards maybe starting to play out in practice, where perhaps these states never envisioned that their allies would one day find themselves subject to arrest warrants of this nature. But it's incumbent on them as parties to the statute, as countries that got together and created this court, to make sure that court is operational, and that involves cooperating.
So we live now in a world where members of the UN Security Council are waging war and are being sanctioned. We are now hearing that member nations of the ICC refusing to carry out their obligations. This sounds like a world moving away from international consensus.
It's I think really the next few years are going to be a real test for the principles on which the International Criminal Court is based. So it's very clear in the issuance of these arrest warrants and the arrest warrants for other high-profile individuals like Vladimir Putin, that the principle is that no one is above the law, that the law applies equally. And really what we're going to see is the extent to which states are going to make this reality happen hopefully by cooperating with the court and making sure that these warrants of arrest are carried out.
Can you see any way in which the issuing of these warrants will actually affect the political dynamics of the Israel-Hamas conflict? Can you see the Israeli Prime Minister in any way changing his approach to this conflict?
It's something that's been debated a lot in the literature, is the idea to which, the extent to which these international criminal prosecutions can have a deterrent effect. One would hope, and this was clear in the issuance of the arrest warrants against both the Israeli suspects and the Hamas suspect, that the court sees its obligation in providing some of the information to on the background to these arrest warrants, as saying, they effectively said, we're keeping the arrest warrants under seal, they're secret, but we're going to give this amount of detail because some of these acts are still ongoing and you should stop. So that includes, for example, blocking humanitarian aid, blocking water, blocking food to Gaza. And in the case of Deif, who's the Hamas military commander for whom a warrant of arrest was issued yesterday, it's releasing the hostages. So again, clearly we can see that there's a hope that in issuing these arrest warrants that it will change behaviour. We just have to wait and see.
Thank you so much, Professor Yvonne McDermott Rees of Swansea University in the UK. Thank you.
Well, for more on this, I'm going to bring in now Antonios Tzanakopoulos. He's a professor of international law at Oxford University, joining me tonight from Geneva, Switzerland. Professor, it's good to have you with us. World leaders are divided over the ICC's arrest warrants. Let me ask you, how likely is it that Benjamin Netanyahu will ever stand trial before the ICC?
Well, these kinds of assessments are hard to make. I suppose it is unlikely, probably in the foreseeable future, but nobody can be certain what events bring. So, it would involve all sorts of factual constellations, like him traveling to a state that is party to the ICC, that state then executing the arrest warrant, and sending him to The Hague, which is not inconceivable.
But it does make Netanyahu's world much smaller, doesn't it? I mean, talk to me about how this arrest warrant could possibly change things for him personally.
Well, I think it has already changed things for both him and former Minister Gallant considerably, because there are 124 states that are parties to the ICC. All these states are bound by treaty to execute the warrant if either of these two persons find themselves within the territory of those states, to put it simply. And so effectively, a large part of the world is no longer accessible to either Netanyahu or Gallant.
There has been some criticism of the court in the fact that it cannot execute the arrest warrants that it issues. Would you agree with me that one of the powers of the ICC is simply its ability to name and shame with these arrest warrants?
Well, look, no court ever has the ability to enforce any of its warrants. We rely on other types of forces for enforcement of warrants. Courts are just people who sit behind a bench and put out pieces of paper with writing on them.
But you don't have a law enforcement infrastructure that you would have in the nation state, for example. You don't have police officers to go and actually carry out the arrest.
But you have to understand that these are obligations on states. And even in the domestic legal order, you do not have police officers that can go and arrest your own state. The fact that Germany complies with the decisions of the German Constitutional Court is not because the German police is going to arrest the German state, because the German state is a fictional entity. So always when we deal with a state, we're not dealing with a physical entity. States comply with the law because the implications of not complying with the law would be inconceivable. So the idea that a state would flat out disobey an arrest warrant by the ICC will have very, very significant implications for that state and, for the position that it takes with respect to the rule of law and so on.
What does it tell you, the fact that we have seen some countries, particularly here in Europe, be somewhat ambivalent to the fact that they are obliged to carry out these arrest warrants if Netanyahu were to be on their territory? I mean, for example, we've seen the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, invite Netanyahu to his country, saying that this arrest warrant would not affect anything.
Well, I think I won't comment on any specific country because it has to do with whether they are parties to the statute and so on and so forth. I would just say that the statements that I've seen from state parties to the ICC statute have been very careful. They have confirmed that they will comply with the law, that they will comply with their treaty obligations, but they have made very careful statements about the fact that this is not necessarily something that is on the cards right now, because, of course, if neither of these two persons ever find themselves in the territory of one of the state's parties, the question doesn't even arise. So lots of states will not necessarily deal with it at this stage.
Professor Antonios Tzanakopoulos, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us on this Friday night. Thank you.
Thank you.